Many people have misunderstood my critique of the video game playing mentality. Many people have misunderstood my critique of the excuse-making mentality because they are highly, highly motivated to misunderstand it. A lot of people are living as adults with a sunk cost fallacy in relation to video games. What does that mean? It means when you've already spent a lot of money on something, you tend to want to justify the purchase you made. You tend to want to invent reasons in your own head to explain to yourself, to reassure yourself that you spent your money in a worthwhile way, that it wasn't just a waste of your money, that something wasn't just a waste of your time or a waste of your resources. Many people who spend hundreds of hours playing video games eagerly want to believe excuses that they have somehow cultivated some redeeming qualities of character, that they've somehow improved their ability to focus on tasks, that they've gained some valuable skill. And obviously the line of reasoning I've opened up here in this discussion deeply challenges that yearning. It makes them reflect on what they've done with video games as just a waste of time. However, I think we are trivializing the question if we only engage in it in terms of contrasting what's a waste of time to what is a meaningful use of your time. I think that is really an inappropriately shallow way to discuss the problem of video games. Although, hey, I try to make videos that are shorter than 40 minutes long discussing the issue, so sometimes I do have to be a bit shallow myself. I have to simplify the issue, talk about it in this way. To say that it's a waste of time is misleading. What we really want to reflect on as adults is what kind of person chooses to play video games, and then what kind of person do I become by investing my time in playing video games? How does it change me? And I think what these people writing into me are desperate to ignore are the very negative effects that they're aware of themselves in terms of the habits of mind, the traits of character that playing video games for long hours inexorably leads to. Playing video games, people say it causes impatience, frustration, an inability to have equanimity and a caring, engaged character when talking to other people face to face. This is partly, of course, because we experience time so very differently when playing video games. On the one hand, video games involve us in moment-to-moment gratification. Pressing a button at just the right split second, at just the right instant, is crucial to doing well in video games. But on the other hand, it brings us into a very different perception of time where 4 hours can disappear as if it were nothing, right? People who play video games have no time for cooking or cleaning. They start to eat the simplest instant food imaginable to devote that time to video games, yes. But then the way they perceive time when they deal with the frustrations of work colleagues and friends and lovers, their impatience for, their frustration with reading a book, studying, sitting still, dealing with the stupidity of others in a caring, concerned, or patient way, which is part of life for all of us. You know, sometimes people are stupid and we can't punish them and we can't just press a button to solve the problem. We have to have some patience and engagement and so on. I think that when we talk about impatience, we're actually using a very simple sounding word for quite a complex phenomenon. And the way in which video games lead us to be impatient and frustrated and punitive characters in relation to other people, I think that's an absolutely terrible set of character traits. And I am just going to appeal to my audience with their own anecdotal experience. I think you know if you search your own feelings, if you reflect on your own youth, your own experiences with playing video games, I think you know this is true. If you think about what it means to be a compassionate, open, engaged, curious person, you know, if you think about what it means to be caring, so on, video games do not cultivate these qualities of character, right? Many people talk about this in terms of, the dopamine reaction and instant gratification, and they try to narrow it down to a flowchart. But I think the truth is, it's something quite profound that we can't simplify in this way. We can't just talk about it in terms of waste of time. We can't just talk about it in terms of dopamine reaction and short-term gratification. In terms of just how profound the difference is, let me say this. I am vegan. If you take someone who eats a cheeseburger diet, someone who eats normal American foods, meat and cheese, what have you, and then one day they go on vacation. For 2 weeks, they eat a vegan diet. So in effect, for 2 weeks, they quit meat, they quit cheese. I don't think there's any tremendous change in how they perceive the world, in how emotionally they react to the world, in how intellectually they engage with the world. I don't think there's any big change. Even though I'm vegan, I'm fond of veganism, I think veganism is quite shallow compared to the profound change you undergo if you're playing video games every day for 3 hours a day, let's say, and then one day you go on vacation, and in the circumstances of that vacation for 2 weeks, you have no computer, no console, no cell phone, no internet access, no video games of any kind. Some of you will have experienced that, maybe in your childhood or something. There is really a profound shift in how emotionally and intellectually you relate to the outside world that's linked to video games being a dominant part of your daily life or the absence of video games, not having video games in your life. I really mean that. I'm not trivializing or dismissing video games lightly. If anything, I'm inviting everyone in the audience to reflect much more deeply on just how profound a difference in our lives video games really make, emotionally and intellectually, in the cultivation of our character. Look, if English is your first language, reading a book in English is not difficult. But one of the most commonly reported things of people who, if you're devoting 2 and 3 hours a day or more than 3 hours a day to playing video games, is the sense of frustration with how slow and unrewarding it is to focus your mind and read a book on paper, to learn from a book that isn't telling you instantly what you want to know. It's not like a pop-up dialogue on a computer. It's not a problem that can be solved by pushing a button. It's not a problem that can be solved by one glowing character punching another glowing character in the face over and over and over again. The type of dulling of the social instincts that comes about through video games and the sharpening of a certain set of antisocial instincts. I think it's something all of us have experience with, even if you've only had one brief period of your life when you played video games a great deal. Okay? Now, the counter-arguments that have been advanced to me, the most legitimate of the counter-arguments, they either rely on a claim that if we calibrate this down to a fine enough point, video games cease to be a problem at all, which is saying, oh, well, what if it's only 20 minutes a day? What if it's only 5 minutes a day? Look, if I tell you a certain food is unhealthy to eat, that doesn't mean that half a teaspoon of that food once a month is unhealthy to eat. It means it's unhealthy to be part of your diet in the way that it's commonly consumed in our culture, right? I mean, the unhealthiest foods imaginable, when they get down to minuscule quantities, all of us in our diet in the modern world, we all eat steel, we all eat aluminum, we all eat dish soap. There's soap left on your food and dishes, and you eat it. It's on your fork and knife. Soap is not healthy to eat, but in tiny amounts you can tolerate it, and all of us do. If you're willing to reduce this down to a point of absurdity, of course. I mean, my argument against playing video games for 3 hours a day, it doesn't make sense if it's against playing video games for 5 minutes a day. Of course I have to concede this point. But then by the same token, if you concede that there is a quantity of nicotine so low, there's a quantity of cigarette so small that the effects on your health, both mental health and physical health, are not significant, where it's not addictive, and where your body is just coping with the toxin, what's the implication of that? What are you saying? That the fact that hypothetically it's possible for someone to ingest such a tiny amount of nicotine that it's not harmful for them, does that mean we're wrong to say that nicotine is harmful? Does that mean I'm wrong to question what kind of person smokes cigarettes and what kind of a person do you become through nicotine addiction? What kind of characteristics, what habits of character? And that's the same question I'm asking about video games. So yeah, this is one line of rationalization, justification. And then the other, people trying to claim, and again, this is really on that emotional basis of the sunk cost fallacy, trying to claim that there's some positive character of mind they get out of it, that there's some characteristic, some ability, some form of mental acuity they get out of this that will justify the thousands of hours put into video games. Now, I feel I already addressed this quite a lot in my earlier video. I talked about two major forms of fallacious reasoning. So very briefly to restate, there's a problem of lack of consideration of opportunity cost, what it is we're comparing this to. We can't compare it to nothing. And here I am forgetting. What was the second point again, guys? Oh, yes, and the fact that the skills are not transferable to the real world. So becoming very skilled at a video game doesn't mean that you have a skill that can be used for anything other than a video game, maybe not even for other genres of video games, right? So that was discussed at some length in the earlier video, okay? The other point is this. The value of whatever it is you can learn from a video game has to be compared to the level of mental accomplishment you were at before commencing that process. So, the claim being made that a video game can increase your interest in the history of World War II, okay, well, only if you were starting from a position of total ignorance or, a grade 3 level of education. Oh, wow, gee, World War II seems interesting. Okay, for someone at that low level of ignorance, yes, it's possible a video game can spread through. What does this justify? Again, it seems like these two problems each relate to the other. So, how many minutes of playing a video game would be justified by this educational benefit that someone who knows nothing about World War II will learn a little bit if this is their first learning about it, right? This doesn't justify playing a video game for 3 hours a day. It doesn't justify playing a video game for 40 hours in total. That there's a tiny, tiny amount of educational value, but only relative to the assumption that you knew absolutely nothing at the beginning. Now look, but still I can concede the point. There were probably, I remember when I was growing up in Canada, there were children who didn't know that India was a country. I remember that. They had never heard of India. I remember that. I remember one kid, this is in junior high, who had never heard of Israel, and who was asking me, what is Israel? There were, really basic facts of geography and history. One of my professors actually once said to me that he had a student at university, in first year of university, who had never heard of World War I and who had also never heard of World War II. This is someone who had completed high school and managed to get into university. And it was kind of a funny story. The student came up to the front of the class. He said, "I'm sorry, during today's lecture, you referred to World War II. So does that mean there was another war before? What were you talking?" So yes, there are some people as children or even as teenagers where, again, in the case of India, I can really imagine there might be someone who's so totally ignorant of India, including, by the way, here in China. There are Chinese people who just have no awareness of the history and culture of India next door, and a video game that makes India look intriguing and exotic. Oh, wow, okay, there's this place called India. But would this be a 5-minute educational, 10 minutes? This is not 3 hours. This is not 40 hours. This is not 3 hours. Very, very little justified that. And again, the next steps you'd have to take, if you did get interested in India, you'd at least have to go and read a Wikipedia article. You'd have to read a book. You'd have to watch a documentary film. You'd have to do something more productive than playing video games. Right? So these same issues were brought up, turned inside out in a very different manner by a longtime viewer of the channel who wrote to me, saying that she's in a relationship, 2 people dating. One of the 2 people reads novels. One of the 2 people plays video games. And the video game player plays video games for perhaps 10 hours per week. So this would not be considered an addiction, but 10 hours per week, still a significant amount of time. And the woman writing into me said, look, she is willing to admit that reading novels is considered a good use of her time, considered not a waste of time, largely just due to kind of cultural prejudices we have, that we're raised to regard novels as somehow a very refined thing to do with your mind. She doesn't feel that reading these novels now as an adult, I'm guessing she's about 22 years old, she doesn't feel that she's really learning anything from these novels. I sympathize. It's completely possible that's true. Reading a book doesn't guarantee there's some kind of wonderful educational value from the book. Some books may be so terrible that you learn less from a book than you learn from a video game. It's possible. The fact that something is printed in book form doesn't mean it's a wonderful educational experience. So she is willing to regard the novels she reads, even though many of them are considered great books of literature, as mere entertainment. I sympathize with her view. I sympathize with her skepticism about the value of reading novels. And she asked the question, look, is it really so different? Should she really be so harsh in regarding video game playing, which goes on, I assume, in her own apartment, with her partner there, for maybe 10 hours a week or something like that? Okay? All right. The value of reading novels is relative to your level of ignorance, much as I said before, all right? There are 8-year-olds and 10-year-olds for whom reading a novel will improve their vocabulary, will improve their spelling, will improve their sentence structure. For myself as a 41-year-old man, already at a very high level of literacy in English, I'm not going to improve anymore. Reading a novel in English is going to have almost zero educational value for me, unless it's a novel that's really specifically about some kind of historical situation that I'm researching, unless there's some kind of factual nonfiction value in the novel. There's some reason why this should be important to me, right? Which would be extraordinary and would be rare, okay? So when your parents and school teachers and professors encouraged you to read novels, they may not have been crazy. The value of the novels themselves doesn't diminish as we get older. The value is subjective. It's relative to you, okay? Bread is not delicious. The value of bread is relative to an empty stomach, a heart, and a mind that desires it. If you're hungry enough, bread tastes delicious. If you're already full, it may taste like nothing at all. The value of the bread is not inherent to the bread, is not intrinsic to the bread. It's extrinsic. It arises from our own desire, our own lack, our own sense of want. Okay? So the value of these novels, the value of these even great works of literature, okay? For the most part, we're kind of trained to misperceive it or overrate it because it does have some significance in terms of pedagogy, in terms of the education of children. Now, the woman who wrote into me, let me ask you, what if you read the same novel in Chinese? I recently got tempted to read the novel Gone with the Wind in Chinese. I'm glad I talked myself out of it. So Gone with the Wind is a novel about white people in the United States of America who own black slaves. But I would be interested in learning the vocabulary and even the sentence structure for how in Chinese they would talk about the history of slavery in America. All right. You can imagine what an incredibly difficult educational experience would be for me or for you to read that novel in Chinese. However, reading it in English, obviously if I'm really interested in the history of slavery and the history of the Civil War, there are better things I can read, okay? So it is a very peculiar comparison. And in this context, where video games aren't attached to other problems, They're not attached to obesity or ruining your education, like dropping out of school. It's not attached to dropping out of college. It's not leading to you losing your job. So, this is a couple where one person reads books, the other person plays video games. And in this case, there isn't a problem with the waste of time element destroying someone's life, not leading to the disintegration of their relationship or anything else. Okay. But this is where we have to stop and really reflect on the extent to which the problem with video games fundamentally is not just that they're a waste of time. The problem is precisely in the cultivation of your own character. The problem is in asking that question: what kind of person, what kind of adult plays video games? What kind of adult makes excuses for playing video games, right? And then what kind of a person do you become? How does that transform your character as time goes on? Now, I say this skeptically. I have known white men who speak English who slept with prostitutes. I knew one guy who started sleeping with prostitutes. That was how he lost his virginity. He started sleeping with prostitutes as a very young guy. I've known several other men who made the decision at different times of their life to commit to sleeping with prostitutes. I remember I met and spoke at length with one guy. He'd only ever had one girlfriend. He dated one woman, and it didn't go well. It didn't work out. And then he just started sleeping with prostitutes for the rest of his life. He never had a normal relationship again. All right. I'm not here to demonize and vilify the role of the prostitute, himself or herself. I'm not here to fearmonger about prostitution one way or the other. All right. There is a very profound question. How, for these men, for the clients of prostitutes, how does it change their character? Who do they become over time sleeping with prostitutes? And we all know, again, even just intuitively, we have some sense of this, of the danger for corroding, the corrosive effect on our lives and our character if we start to go down this road, right? If we engage in the commodification of sexuality, if the most intimate relationships in our lives become something that's bought and sold, right? Apart from the question of the impact on the life of the prostitute or the economy or ethical questions that are external, just subjectively, just in a self-centered way, I think there has to be a profound sense of concern for what kind of a man pays prostitutes, what kind of a man makes excuses for paying prostitutes for sex. Again, if this is you over time doing this again and again, what kind of person do you become? And of course, it's interesting to note, I don't think anyone is wealthy enough. Very few people are wealthy enough that they could possibly be spending 10 hours a week with prostitutes. This is probably something these guys did for 2 hours a month or something. I mean, all right, multimillionaires could be spending 10 hours a week in the company of prostitutes. For the most part, this doesn't add up to many hours the way video games do, right? And of course, part of my interaction with these guys was using Socratic method to challenge the excuses they'd made. Because as I warn you again and again, quitting video games is hard. Quitting the excuses is even harder. Overcoming the excuse-making mentality is the hardest part of all right? And these guys who sleep with prostitutes, even if they only sleep with prostitutes for 2 hours a week, 4 hours a week, whatever it is, they're living with the excuses 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. All right? And those excuses change the way they feel. They change the way they feel about women. They change the way they feel about relationships. They change the way they feel about earning money in the economy, right? They change the excuses they live with, change the way they see the world, change the way that they emotionally and intellectually experience the world. That's the most startling, concerning, corrosive thing about video games. When you play video games as an adult for many hours a week, all right, it changes the way emotionally and intellectually you react to the world. It changes the way you perceive the world. It changes the way you feel about the world. And that's why it's such a shock. It's so strange. It's such an adjustment if you go from playing video games for 3 hours a day to stopping, whether that's on a vacation or otherwise. Even if you didn't choose to quit, but you just circumstances, for a couple of weeks, you're cut off from all that. You stop playing video games. And you start to feel differently. You start to think differently. You start to perceive time differently. You start to relate to other people differently. There are all these changes that come into your life, right? And I admit, quitting meat, by contrast, is much more shallow. I'm going to be honest with you, I think that quitting nicotine, quitting smoking, is much more shallow. When we talk about the impatience of that video game playing mentality, and, the excuses that you have to wear like armor all the time, right? The same way that the men who sleep with prostitutes, to some extent, they're always wearing this armor because they don't want to feel ugly, they don't want to feel weak, they don't want to feel immoral, they don't want to feel stupid, they don't want to feel like a trick. What am I going to say? They know that this is something shameful. They know this is something most people in the society think they should be ashamed of. And some of them, to some extent, feel ashamed or feel regret or just feel some wish that they could have lived another way or a better way. Some of them, not all of them, right? But they wear the armor of their excuses all the time, okay? Whether they do that by mocking it and making light of it and joking about it, or whether they do it by presenting tremendously serious philosophies that justify their own. I've heard it all. I've heard the whole range of those kinds of excuses from men. And actually, I've read books about it too. I did some formal desk research on that topic, which is quite interesting. There have been some good books written about that. Okay? Men who spend hundreds of hours, adult men who spend hundreds of hours engaged in children's entertainment, playing video games, they also live wearing an armor to try to separate themselves from that sense of shame. They want to feel strong, not weak. They want to feel smart, not stupid. They never want to face up to that sunk cost fallacy where they look back at their life and say, wow, I had amazing opportunities and I squandered them, sitting on the couch, playing this fundamentally childish, repetitive, and yes, addictive form of entertainment, video games.